So my experience is that people come to Zen practice for a variety of different reasons. Some seeking enlightenment, complete end to suffering. Others just a little bit of peace of mind, get a control of the monkey mind. And then some specifically to work with anxiety, depression, to deal with loss, grief. So a variety of different reasons. But I think the common thread is that everybody wants to feel good inside. So they want the mind to be at peace and that headaches to not be there, for anxiety and tension in the chest and belly to not be there, and just to be relaxed inside. And the Buddha talked about shamatha and vipassana. So shamatha is serenity, vipassana is insight. And he said that there are some people approach enlightenment through serenity, some people approach enlightenment through insight, but the common and probably most effective way is to approach through serenity and insight. So there's this back and forth of questioning, looking, thinking, using the discerning mind, and then letting go and sinking into space, into emptiness. And then that takes us to a new place. And then there's a new thing to grab onto and look at and question, and to the point where the mind is just done with it. It's ready to just stop and say, okay, I'm ready to sit now. And that's how, koans are often talked about, is your mind beats this koan to death until eventually the mind is so tired with it that it just pops or just lets go. And then the expression or the live words or the answer comes naturally. Oh, so what is true nature? So basic goodness, I heard that.
Oneness.
Okay. With what?
Yes.
So where is it right now? Where is true nature right now?
Mm-hmm. Maybe it's all true nature.
Right. What is not true nature?
Right.
Is there a false nature anywhere that you can see right now? So Dogen, a lot of Dogen's teachings were saying we're already there.
Mm-hmm.
There's no problem. We just have to realize it. So when we sit and practice realization. We don't practice for realization, that when we are sitting and when we are, and sitting not just on the cushion, but when we're sitting walking, when we're sitting driving, when we're sitting listening right now, that realization is already happening. That we're realizing true nature then. So maybe any moment that we stop and just allow, there's a true nature that we're realizing that is already there. Right? And so there's this, so then there can be this thing of like, well, if it's there, why is it so hard to, and that's the practice, right? Is over time realizing what we already have, or what is already us. So let's talk about what gets in the way. What is the barrier to realizing true nature? I had a client the other day, and we are in the middle of a session, and he's talking, and he drops his earphones that were connected to his phone because he's fiddling around with stuff in his hands while he's talking. And without skipping a beat, he reaches down, and as he's still talking to me, picks up the headphones or the earbuds and coils them up and does something with them with his hands. Right? So our body is always aware. Our body is always aware. So I have a koan or two about that. Case 89, Blue Cliff Record, hands and eyes all over. Ungon asked Dogo, what does the Bodhisattva of great compassion use so many hands and eyes for? Like someone reaching back for a pillow in the middle of the night. I understand. How do you understand? All over the body. Dogo said, you've said quite a bit, but you've only expressed 80%. Ungon said, what about you? Dogo said, throughout the body are hands and eyes. So in the middle of the night, imagine sleeping and your neck is doing something and your hand reaches back and grabs that pillow. You know, was there any consciousness of that? Any memory of that? Maybe not. I have a lot of clients who have DUIs, and they talk about how many times they drove home and had no idea how they got home. So what was functioning? For them, that's their connection to God. You know, in the AA realm, a lot of people say, who was there for you that got you home? All those times when you were blacked out. So in Christian speak or in other speak, that's God. What is it in Buddha speak? You know, who's the one making our heart beat right now? Who's the one processing information? Are we in control of that? So throughout the body are hands and eyes, always aware. There's so then this next column will bring in the other part. So this is case 72, Book of Equanimity. Chuyu's monkey. Attention, Kyozan asked Chuyu, what is the meaning of Buddha nature? Chuyu replied, for your sake, I'll tell you a simile. There is a room with 6 windows, and in the middle is a monkey. So put yourself in there. So you're in a room, you're the monkey, and you're looking through 6 windows. A person calls out, monkey, monkey, and the monkey responds. In a like manner, when all the 6 windows are called, they all respond. Kyozan asked, what about when the monkey sleeps? Chuyu got down from his meditation cushion and grabbed him, saying, monkey, monkey, you and I have just met. So what are those 6 windows?
Our senses?
Yeah. So what is the 6th sense? Because we usually think of 5 in the U.S.
Our thoughts.
Yeah, so thinking, the thinking mind being the 6th sense. So at all times, these windows of awareness are functioning, whether we are conscious of them or not. So if something came flying out of the corner, my body would do that, right? When you're driving, there's this, like, okay, who here has texted and drove before? Sometimes I'm even like, I've got my my koan, my book of koans here studying. You like, you know, trying to memorize on the way back from work to sit that night. So what I think of is, and then the monkey. So then we have the monkey. So we have the monkey that's becoming conscious. So I want to make a distinction for our purposes today, not for some global use. The distinction between awareness and consciousness. So awareness is what I think of as the body being aware. The body's always aware. It's kind of like if you had those new cars that can sense everything and they can drive themselves, right? So our body can function quite well without a driver being conscious. And then there's consciousness. And consciousness is this other piece that I think is what we identify with as self. And it's this thing that can actually move around and become conscious of different aspects of awareness. So right now, we can be conscious of the sensations of our back making contact with the chair. We can move our conscious, we can become conscious of the awareness of sound right now. So all of these senses are constantly accessible to us. including thinking, and we can move our consciousness around to be aware of all these different zones of awareness or windows. So in the beginning, I think, and for I think many people, consciousness is stuck in thoughts. It's stuck there. And so people go and do very sensational events like rock climbing or a fun park or a movie or drugs, wild sex, a really good book, whatever kind of thing, to extract consciousness from thinking. So then we can have a moment of experience of now. And so we have to do these very intense experiences to make those things happen, to make that extraction happen. And so when people have an LSD experience, and I have lots of clients who have this, and when I lived in monasteries before here, I would always ask, what brings you to practice? And one of the common experiences was, I had an LSD trip and it woke me up. And so when people say that, I think what's happening, and I remember experience for myself, is consciousness extracts from its normal neural pathways, and it has its experience of nowness for a moment, or for a little while, of joy, of presence, of true reality, true nature, emptiness, whatever you want to call it, for that split second or for that little bit. Then consciousness says, that was great. I want more of that. So how do I do more of that? LSD, more LSD. For me, it was going rock climbing and dedicating my life to rock climbing for a period of time and having lots of sensational experiences. Because most people say when you rock climb, there was no room for thinking. When I was on that rock, there was no room to think at all. And it felt great. I feel great. But as soon as you get down off the rock, it's like a rubber band. Consciousness just sucks right back into that old set of neural pathways of thinking. And also chasing after certain pleasures that the child's brain learned to seek, like food, TV, whatever. So our spiritual practice, so then eventually someone comes to spiritual practice. So here they see the footsteps of the ox, which I'm going to say the ox is the body. The ox is our body, including aspects of brain and mind, thinking, discerning, the executive functions. So there's this moment where consciousness separates and says, oh, what's that? There was something there. What was that? Then we practice, we start to meditate, and we find the body eventually. I think there's lots of practitioners who actually don't find the body for a long, long time. Luckily, we have really wonderful teachers here who encourage us and push us sometimes into feeling the body. So what does it mean to feel the body? So there's initially the practices of breath, hara, breathing through the perineum, through the pelvic floor, earth breathing. Listening to sounds. For 2 years, I just listened to sounds in my meditation, which was really beautiful. But the body also includes emotions, trauma, pain, joyful emotions, happiness, loss, grief, fear, anxiety. And that's a really, really uncomfortable place to be, the body. I had a client yesterday who has done lots and lots of psychedelics and lots of drugs, and he can get dissociated, and he starts going on and on about the physics and the metaphysics of the universe and how he could connect to this rock. And this is his energy. And I can connect to this rock. He actually speaks way faster than this. And I can connect to the rock, and there are vibrations going between me and the rock, and so on and so forth. And I try to help him learn what it's like to be embodied, to come back, and to bring that consciousness back into the body. And he specifically said yesterday, I don't want to be there. That is not a place I want to be. And that for me was true. So when I had some traumatic events happen in my late teens, I avoided my body. You know, I sought sensational pleasures, but I avoided the emotional life for almost 10 years. And then I found my way to Zen practice, and I started to feel emotions again as I was meditating more, and I didn't like it. And Tenshin Roshi at Yokoji said specifically to me, he said, feel the anger. Feel it. Don't run away from it, don't think about it, let go of the thoughts, and just feel it. So in psychotherapy, in our practice here, and what I think is a holistic, healthy approach to spirituality, no matter what religion or spiritual angle you're coming from, the body has to be involved for it to be healthy. And actually, that is the avenue to awakening. This is possibly my favorite book on Buddhism, which is Reggie Ray's Touching Enlightenment, Finding Realization in the Body. What does all this somatic work have to do with spirituality and, frankly, with meditation? We need to realize that when we develop somatic awareness and enter into the process of relaxation and release, we are not just making peace with our physical existence. In fact, we are entering into a process that lies right at the heart of the spiritual life itself, something the Buddha saw a very long time ago. As we move through the process of discovery, it begins to dawn on us that the body has an agenda of its own that it wants us to follow. And so that's what this is about. As we make contact with the body, it's wild. It wants to have sex with things people that we shouldn't do, right? But another part of it says, no, don't do that. It wants to eat all kinds of things that it probably shouldn't. It wants to buy things because it feels good to buy things, but then you get in financial debt. It wants to be angry and self-righteous. It wants to, because that feels good, power feels good. It wants to do all kinds of things. That earlier we were just riding that wave without even knowing it. We were riding the boat, or riding the body without really much consciousness of it. We were just doing what it was taught to do, what it was trained to do from age 0 to 12. So, in psychotherapy and psychology, it's said that we are who we are by the age of 6 or 10 years old. So we have developed our way of dealing with the world already by the age of 6 to 10 years old. So depending on where you got your training, you might have developed some really functional, healthy ways of doing that. Or you might not have. Or you might have gotten some good training and some not so good training. And that training comes not just from our parents, but from culture, from the environment we grew up in, from the traumas we had. And that training comes from ourselves. So our brain, when we have a traumatic event happen to us in childhood, our brain figures out some way to protect us from ever having that feeling again. So if we had deep shame, if we had deep loss, if our parents separated when we were young or divorced, or we saw abuse happening in the family, or we were sexually molested, or anything like that, any kind of abuse, there's a feeling that's associated with that. Hurt, sadness, loss, fear, separation, aloneness, loneliness, guilt, shame. All of those things, or many of them, could be associated to one event or to each individual event. So then our brain creates neural pathways that says, how can we never feel that again, because that sucked. So we create these defense mechanisms. That's the ego. Or there's other feelings that we had that were great, and we want to have those again. So then our brain says, how do we keep having lots of that? So then our brain creates a system to make sure that that gets satisfied over and over and over again. Again, ego. All of that is what the ego is. And I also say that that's the body. So the brain and the body work together so that when we feel a certain thing, our body and our brain knows exactly where to go to make that change or keep it going in the way we want it to. So as we become conscious of this thing, we separate out and we see this whole thing, the body and everything that's going on. Now we have this new thing that is wild. And also the freedom that comes along with emptiness, the freedom that comes with serenity, with seeing ourselves for what we really are. There's a lot of power to that. And if we have old habits that haven't been worked through yet, that haven't been looked at, then you can attach that power that comes from clarity to a body that still likes to do this. And this is where we get a lot of offenses happening from teachers and to their students. And people with power misusing power in spiritual realms. Is that there's behaviors, there's things that they haven't looked at yet. Yes, and also someone can have a inflated idea of themselves, and so they can have power from that, for example. So arrogance or grandiosity. So they can have a feeling and an access to power based off of a misunderstanding of reality or a misunderstanding of themselves.
Okay, yeah. Okay, so they're kind of different. Right?
I mean, yes, I think there are a lot of different things going on inside of us. So when I see that ox, I see a lot of different things happening. And so when I say the body, that's why I include the executive functioning parts of the brain, the midbrain. So the executive functioning parts of the brain are the human part of the brain. The midbrain is the mammalian part of the brain, the animal brain. And then we have the brainstem, which is the reptilian part of the brain. Each of those has different motivations. The reptilian brain doesn't feel shame, it doesn't feel guilt. It's a reptile. It just survives. It gets its needs met. And doesn't care a whole lot about what else, how it affects other things. The mammalian part of the brain, animals do feel sadness. They do feel loneliness. And so mammals have a sense of connection that they need, and they have a sense of karma. So they can see, they can feel a response when they've done something that was hurtful to something else, I think. I feel like I've seen animals do that. And then they feel fear of doing that again, and so they don't do it again. So animals, work together quite well, in the animal kingdom in groups. Many of them do. And then we have the human brain, which is rational and can think abstractly and has memory. So the Buddha called this the eighth consciousness, the storehouse consciousness. The seventh and the eighth consciousnesses. The other six being the senses. So the seventh and eighth consciousness is this other aspect of the ox, of the body. So, in practice, here, traditionally speaking, the person has had a kensho experience. They've had an awakening experience, but they still have behaviors that are in alignment with the precepts or in alignment with having wholesome karma. There's an energy to it that's like, whoa, what was that? Access to emptiness, access to freedom in that way, yet it's kind of back and forth into the self and out of the self and into the self and out of the self. So there can be a long period of time of taming the ox, of working towards taming the ox, taming the body, taming the mind, aligning mind with true reality, and healing old wounds, healing trauma, healing the ego, the defense structures that protected us for so long. So there's many stories where and if anybody remembers, there's a specific name of somebody I'm trying to think of, where the student had an enlightenment experience, had a very deep enlightenment, very deep Satori awakening, and then the teacher sent him away for 20 years. Like, go away for 20 years, and at 20 years you can start teaching. And that was to go refine that awakening, to learn to tame that ox, to bring that ox and consciousness together. So eventually, if you go look at the pictures outside, eventually the ox and the consciousness both drop away, because they're working in such alignment together. And Bodhidharma. Bodhidharma said, Buddhas don't recite sutras, Buddhas don't keep precepts, and Buddhas don't break precepts. Buddhas don't keep or break anything. Buddhas don't do good or evil. And in our training here, in the koan training, you do koan training for quite a long time before you actually really study the precepts on a very deep level, and then the precepts are studied as koans. And there's a balance here. So I personally think, and I think many Zen practitioners and Buddhist practitioners think it's very important to study the precepts in the beginning as well, which I think we all do on our own or in our own ways, and we have precepts classes starting here soon. But precepts can be this added layer that is a rule that other parts of us end up fighting against. And so we're trying to tame that ox without even knowing what the ox is in the first place, by using the precepts in the beginning. But it keeps us from developing more karma that creates more problems for us in the future and for others. That is, the intention, part of the intention behind the precepts. Later, after that true nature is seen, the ox is seen, then the precepts become just an avenue of taming that ox, and bringing that person's awakening into a useful way into the world to serve others without hurting others. When I think I've said this, I just want to kind of emphasize it, that when we heal the emotions, when we heal the deep wounds that we all carry around, then we don't need the protection anymore. And it's that protection that's actually creating distance between us and other people. It's that protection that is harming other people in our lives. It's also the patterns that we sought to seek out pleasure. So if we really learn that sex is great, and using power in sex, power dynamics in sex is great, and if that doesn't get looked at, felt, experienced, and examined, then that thread remains right there in the storehouse consciousness, which Freud called the unconscious. And that can still be played out as someone becomes a teacher or a senior student or something like that later on. So we see a lot of sex issues, we see a lot of power dynamics, money, extortion, these kinds of things. Because we're human beings, we're easily addicted to things. Our brains become very easily addicted to pleasurable experiences. In the Roshi's book, The Great Heart Way, they talk about how a positive feeling can go along with a negative or harmful experience. And so I talk about that with one of my clients yesterday, actually. He gets a pleasure from doing passive-aggressive things that people will never know that he did. And he talked about that, in session, about how he gets this pleasure, this joy out of slamming a door when he knows somebody doesn't like the door being slammed. So these things have to be examined and looked at through our practice. So emptiness and insight, serenity, insight. This Oxherding picture here, where the self, the ego, the consciousness, the sense of self is riding harmoniously on the ox. You can see that in a person. You can see a lightness, a gentleness, a self-acceptance, a calmness, a joy, a friendliness, a willingness, an availability, a welcoming in a person when that's happening. And they don't have to be a Zen practitioner for that. They might have had very good training when they were a kid. And they just have a few issues as human beings. They might not even be a spiritual practitioner of any kind. So this is not a thing that only happens for people who meditate. But what I have found is that people who are attracted to meditation and training had some things that weren't working out so well inside, that weren't aligned, there's some kind of suffering that brings us to practice. And because of that work that we do, we can be available to help others who also have those same misalignments, I guess you could say. Ken Wilber, he talks about stages and states. So a stage is where we are functioning from, and a state is an experience that we might have that then influences our progression to the next stage. So, for example, you as a practitioner might be at the second Oxherding picture here, and this is kind of the stage a person is functioning from, but they might have an experience, a state experience of the 6th or the 9th or the 8th Oxherding picture. And then after that experience, we come back to our stage, but from my experience, and I bet many of you experienced this as well, and it's talked about in many books, that when you have some kind of opening, it's not just there. It actually continues to, kind of like a cumulus cloud grows. It just keeps unfolding and growing and blowing up in new and different ways, and the mind keeps opening because it knows consciousness has now seen that there's something else out there, and it wants to keep expanding. Right. So then we maybe move into a new stage. Etiquette in the Zendo. And we have a Zendo etiquette. We have an Abbey etiquette that will be coming out soon for those of us who live here and for people who are coming here on retreat. These are opportunities for us to tame that ox. Every time when we hit up against something in Sesshin, why do we have to bow here? Why do I have to turn to the right instead of to the left? Why do we do this chant? Why? Anytime we feel resistance to something in our Zen training, another person in the Sangha, something our teacher said to us, that is our old defense mechanisms, usually, not always, but usually, bumping up against reality as it is. So those are opportunities for us to tame the ox, to look at something that's going on inside of us that's stuck, that's scared, that's hurt. Meditation is the foundation for Zen practice. The metaphor I like to use is that if you took some North Carolina clay, that hard red clay, if you douse that with water, over time it will soften up, the edges will soften, and over lots of time the whole thing will turn into a mud puddle. That's our meditation. That's what our meditation does to ego, to defenses, to structures inside. Then therapy, insight, looking, digging, playing, fondling with all our habits. That's like the sun coming out and that water evaporating into the atmosphere and leaving nothing but a little bit of sand. So we have to soften with the meditation and then dissipate with the insight. That's just one way to look at it. There's probably many ways to look at that, but that's one metaphor. And so the precepts are koans. And we'll talk about this next week. The precepts are koans. Yeah, how do I use a precept as a mirror to look at not just my behavior, but my motivation, my drive, my desire, my resistance? How do I use that to look within? And that's what all the teachings are. They're just fingers pointing at this moon. That's right here. Actually, I will just finish with this, is what Kent said, or what Eugen said, is that with all these concepts, with all these thoughts, with all these ideas, it all really does just come back to feeling and being right here. If you want to, and Bodhidharma says this, if you want to find Buddha, you have to look in yourself. If you want to find mind, you have to look at mind, which you could say heart-mind. So our work is here, you know. And there's so many things that attract us and draw us out there. And there are things out there. There are people out there suffering. There's an earth out there that's being destroyed by our greed and ignorance. So that's true. That's out there. But in terms of clarifying and understanding reality, that's found here. That happens here, from my experience.